The air inside the federal courtroom felt sharper than the January wind outside, heavy with that particular quiet that comes before something irreversible. I stood just beyond the threshold, my hand resting lightly on the polished brass door handle, letting the sound of murmured voices wash over me. My name is Morgan Hale. I thought the words steady in my mind, though I didn't speak them aloud. And in about 30 seconds, my sister will learn everything she's ever said about me was a lie. The bailiff's voice cut through the chatter. All rise. The doors swung open, and I stepped into the light, my service dress uniform catching in the glare from the overhead fixtures. Silver stars gleamed on my shoulders. Ribbons told their own story across my chest colors, earned in places Elena Vargas had only ever read about. I didn't look at her at first. I let my gaze pass over the judge, the panel of officers, the crowded gallery. Only then did I turn toward the defense table. She froze mid-whisper, to her attorney eyes-wide mouth, parting just slightly, as if a laugh had been caught and strangled in her throat. The woman who once told a room full of strangers that I washed out of basic training was staring at the deputy commander of U.S. Army Cyber Command. I kept walking each step deliberate on the hardwood floor. This wasn't revenge. That's too hot, too messy. This was colder, cleaner, and it had been 15 years in the making. I took my seat-spine straight hands, still the weight of the moment pressing down, like the click of a rifle bolt sliding into place. The restaurant glittered with too much light and too little warmth. Crystal chandeliers dangled above polished mahogany tables, each one set with linens so stiff they might have stood on their own. I hadn't planned to be here. It was my parents' celebration for Elena's promotion to CEO of Armitage Defense Solutions. But a last-minute change to my travel orders had left me with a rare weekend in Boston. An invitation had arrived in my inbox the night before, clearly an afterthought. I slipped into my seat at the far end of the table, near the coat check, while the real conversation hummed at the head. My parents flanked Elena like loyal retainers, laughing too loudly at every modest joke, refilling her wineglass before the server even noticed it was low. Halfway through the third course, Elena's voice lifted just enough to pull the surrounding tables into her orbit. "Oh, and this is my sister Morgan," she said, tilting her head toward me, as though I were an after-dinner mint she'd forgotten to mention. "She even tried the army once, remember? Didn't last 2 weeks in basic training. Now she's got some temp job in government admin." The words landed like the clink of silverware on fine china, small, precise, and deliberate. A man across from her, a senior contracts executive I recognized instantly from the Pentagon's procurement briefings, glanced my way. His expression was polite, unreadable, but his eyes lingered a beat too long. He knew exactly what her statement implied, and so did I. I felt the old chill settle in my chest, the one I'd carried since the day I learned in my own family's language service meant nothing unless it came with a corner office and a corporate logo. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. Silence in moments like this was its own weapon. When the server cleared my plate, I caught the faintest flicker in the executive's eyes. He didn't believe her. Tomorrow morning, he'd be sitting in a secure conference room while I briefed him on the most sensitive counterintelligence operation in the Army's portfolio. But tonight, I let Elena finish her story, smiling when others laughed. Let them think they'd marked me. Some debts are paid in words, others in time. And mine had been accruing interest for years. The first time I understood my place in my family was a June afternoon, thick with the smell of cut grass and my mother's pot roast. I was 18, standing in our living room in a freshly pressed ROTC uniform, holding an acceptance letter to officer candidate school. It was the kind of achievement that made other parents beam, the kind that came with competition so fierce you didn't dare dream about it until the envelope was in your hands. My father glanced at the letter, patted me on the shoulder, like I'd just told him I'd gotten a part-time job at the mall, and said, "That's nice, Morgan. Just be careful. No questions, no pride. Just a warning tossed out like crumbs on the floor." An hour later, he handed Elena a set of keys tied up in a red bow. Outside in the driveway sat a brand-new sedan gleaming in the summer light. My mother clapped, telling Elena how much safer her path was now that she'd been accepted into an Ivy League business program. The message was clear. Elena was headed somewhere important. I was taking a detour they'd rather not talk about. When the moment passed, my mother slipped me a $50 bookstore gift card, as if it were an afterthought. I smiled, thanked her, and carried that quiet comparison with me for years. By the time I was a colonel, briefing three-star generals on cyber threats and overseeing teams stretched across 3 continents, my family still thought I worked some kind of desk-bound placeholder job. They'd never see the classified maps covering my office walls or the secure servers humming behind triple-locked doors. I stopped trying to explain somewhere along the way. It was easier to let them believe I was the quiet failure than to drag them into a world they had no interest in understanding. But a few months after that Boston dinner, a new case landed on my desk. The codename Hawthorne Vale. The target, a senior defense contractor suspected of selling proprietary targeting data to a hostile entity. And when the evidence file loaded on my screen, the name at the top was one I knew better than my own reflection. Elena Vargas. I stared at the name for a long time, the glow of the monitor casting hard edges on the walls of my office. For a moment, the air felt thinner, as if the secure compartmented room itself was holding its breath. 15 years of old slights, clipped words, and calculated dismissals pressed at the edges of my mind. But they didn't spill over. Instead, something colder slid into place: clarity. Regulation required that I disclose any personal connection to an investigation target. So I walked the short hallway to Lieutenant General Robert Keating's office. He was a man who valued results over pedigree, who never confused rank with worth. I stood at attention, laid out the facts: my sister's position, the suspected breaches, my history with her. I told him I was prepared to step aside to protect the integrity of the case. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the unblinking patience of a man who'd commanded through more than one war. "Colonel Hale," he said finally, "you know her habits, her network, her blind spots. That's not a conflict, it's an advantage. You'll continue to run the operational side, and it will be done by the book. No mistakes." It wasn't a request. It was a vote of confidence. From that moment, my war wasn't fought in heated arguments or public confrontations. It was fought under the hum of fluorescent lights, in meticulously drafted warrants, and airtight evidence chains. My team dissected terabytes of data, following digital threads across borders and back. Every subpoena approved, every seized device cataloged, was a quiet move in a game she didn't know she was playing. I kept my tone, even my reports precise, as if this were any other case. But in the privacy of those windowless rooms, I allowed myself one truth: I would not let this slip through the cracks. Weeks blurred into months, the evidence mounting into something unshakable. And then, on a Tuesday that smelled faintly of rain on concrete, my aide stepped in with a single-page document. "Congratulations, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the ghost of a smile. "Promotion to Brigadier General, effective immediately." The silver star sat in its velvet-lined case, like it had always been meant to be, there, small enough to fit in my palm, heavy enough to change the gravity of the room. I'd earned it through years of operations most people would never hear about. But now it carried an additional weight: authority over the court-martial proceedings for my own sister. I closed the case with a quiet click. This wasn't about satisfaction. It wasn't about proving anything to my parents or erasing years of their casual dismissals. This was about the system I'd sworn to serve. If Elena had betrayed it, she would answer to it. Over the next weeks, I signed off on the last of the warrants, reviewed transcripts, and coordinated with the Judge Advocate General's office. The case file grew thicker by the day. Digital forensics reports intercepted communications, financial audits that painted a picture no spin doctor could whitewash. Elena's legal team came in hard-acting, like they were handling a corporate compliance hiccup instead of a national security breach. They filed motions, demanded delays, tried to muddy the waters. None of it slowed the machine. My machine. When the trial date was set, I knew exactly how it would unfold. The Washington District Courtroom was steeped in tradition: dark wood, polished brass, the seal of the United States hanging over the bench like an unblinking eye. My parents would be there, wearing the same unearned confidence they always wore around Elena. They'd expect me to sit quietly in the gallery, maybe in a suit I'd bought off the rack, looking worried for my poor sister. They wouldn't expect to see me walk through the main doors, with the authority of the convening officer, the entire room rising to their feet on command. That image stayed with me in the days leading up to the trial, not as a fantasy, but as a reminder. The truth, when it arrived, would not be loud or chaotic. It would be deliberate. It would be undeniable. And it would land like the sound of a gavel, sealing a verdict that had been written long before the first charge was filed. The morning of the trial broke cold and bright, the kind of winter light that made every shadow sharper. I arrived through a side entrance, my uniform immaculate, every ribbon and medal aligned to the millimeter. The corridors smelled faintly of floor polish and paper, orderly, sterile, nothing like the storm about to break inside. From my designated waiting room, I could hear the muffled cadence of opening statements. The lead prosecutor, an Army major, with a voice like a sharpened blade, would be walking the panel through procurement fraud data leaks and the danger they posed to deployed personnel. He'd outline the entire operation codename Hawthorne Vale and credit it to a commander they knew only by title, Task Force Sentinel. They wouldn't yet connect that title to me. Then came the moment we'd planned for. The bailiff's voice rang out beyond the heavy oak doors. All rise for the Deputy Commander, U.S. Army Cyber Command, Brigadier General Morgan Hale. I stepped through the doorway. The sound hit first chairs, scraping back boots striking the floor in unison. Even the judge rose. My gaze swept the room with measured calm, the jury of senior officers, the prosecutor standing at attention, the defense frozen mid-breath. And then I let my eyes find Elena. Her expression fractured in real-time confusion, disbelief, then something colder, like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. She searched my face for the sister she remembered, but all she saw was the officer with the authority to seal her fate. My father, reflexes from his brief Army stint, overriding everything else, stood at a shaky version of attention. My mother clutched her handbag so tightly, her knuckles blanched. I moved to my seat without hesitation, nodding once to the judge before sitting. The star on my shoulder wasn't just rank, it was the final, undeniable truth neither of them could talk over or laugh away. In that silence, I didn't need to say a word. The room already understood exactly who I was. The proceedings stretched over several tense days, each witness and exhibit, adding another steel beam to the structure of the case. I didn't speak from the stand. My role was to observe, to ensure the process was clean, precise, and impossible to challenge. From my seat, I watched Elena's confidence erode in increments. At first, she leaned into her attorney's whispered reassurances. By the second day, she was taking notes furiously, her pen tapping against the legal pad like a metronome of panic. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterclass in control. They walked the panel through intercepted messages, server logs, and bank transfers that connected her to every breach. No theatrics, just the weight of fact after fact, until even the defense seemed smaller behind their table. When the panel withdrew to deliberate, the room exhaled. My parents avoided looking in my direction. I didn't mind. The moment of truth wasn't for them. It didn't take long. The panel of senior officers returned their expressions as unreadable as marble. The presiding officer stood reading each charge, followed by the same verdict: guilty. 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 The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the gallery. Elena's shoulders slumped. Her lawyer stared at the table as if the grain in the wood could offer an escape. My father shifted in his seat. My mother's lips moved, but no sound came out. The clerk brought the official findings to my desk. The paper was thick, the kind meant for permanence. My pen felt heavier than usual as I signed my name, clear, steady, final. It wasn't triumph that settled over me then. It was something quieter, a deep sense of balance restored. The uniform I wore had never been about proving anything to them, but in that moment, it had stripped away every lie they'd told about me. I stood, nodded once to the judge, and left the courtroom without a glance back. The verdict would live on in the record. I had no need to see their faces as it sank in. Outside, the winter air felt cleaner. A year to the day after the verdict, I stood on a stage beneath warmer lights, facing a sea of uniforms. The graduation ceremony at the U.S. Army War College was a place for the next generation of senior leaders, to mark the start of their own uphill climb. Rows of colonels and newly pinned generals looked up, waiting for my keynote. I spoke about integrity, the kind that holds when the room is empty and no one's taking notes. About command as a burden, not a trophy. I told them the truth I'd lived, that in our line of work, there will always be people who underestimate you, sometimes even the ones who share your blood. And that the only validation worth anything comes from knowing you did the job right. When the applause came, it was the measured, grounded kind that told me they'd heard more than just the words. Colleagues, my real family, gathered afterward, debating points I'd raised, sharing their own hard-earned lessons. There was no flattery, no empty praise, only respect. My aide now, Colonel Davis, wove through the crowd to hand me a secure tablet. An operational update glowed on the screen. I scanned it, my focus shifting back to the mission with the ease of muscle memory. That's when my personal phone buzzed. The number on the screen made me pause. My mother's. The text was short. "We're proud of you. We just never knew. Can we talk?" For a moment, the echo of an old ache stirred the faint shadow of the girl who would have given anything to hear those words. But it passed. Their pride wasn't a currency I traded in anymore. My worth had been proven in places they'd never stepped foot in, to people who didn't need me to translate my value. I set the phone face down on the table, the screen going dark, and turned back to my team. We had work to do, and that was where I belonged. The ledger was balanced, the chapter closed. In the months that followed, I thought less and less about Elena's trial. The headlines faded, her name slipped out of conversation, and the world moved on, as it always does. But in the stillness of early mornings, when the base was just waking, and the corridors were quiet, I sometimes caught myself remembering the look in her eyes that day in court. Not with bitterness, but with a strange detached clarity. People imagine justice as something loud, a gavel slamming voices raised a moment that shakes the walls. In my experience, the truest victories are quieter. They don't demand attention. They simply stand unshaken when the noise dies down. That day in the courtroom, my victory was not her conviction. It was the truth, standing in full view, impossible to erase. I never answered my mother's message. Not out of spite, but because I had nothing left to say. Reconciliation requires two people willing to walk the same road, and I'd stopped walking theirs a long time ago. Instead, I poured my time into the work. New threats, new operations, new soldiers coming up through the ranks. I mentored the ones who reminded me of myself at their age, quiet, capable, overlooked, until the moment they weren't. I told them what no one had told me, that their worth wasn't dependent on who recognized it, and that the sharpest blade in leadership is consistency. On the anniversary of my promotion, I found myself back in the secure briefing room where Hawthorne Vale had begun. The same hum of servers, the same cold light, the same heavy table. Only now I was sitting at the head of it. I thought of the girl with the $50 bookstore gift card standing off to the side, while the family celebrated someone else's achievement. She'd never have believed this was where she'd end up, not because she lacked ambition, but because she'd been taught her ceiling was lower. That girl was gone. The woman in her place didn't measure herself against anyone else's expectations. She measured herself against the oath she'd taken and the standard she upheld. And in that, there was a peace no verdict, no apology, no family approval could touch. The victory wasn't in proving them wrong. It was in knowing I'd been right all along.